For those of you who are new, or let's talk about it, Dan Rabinowitz, our board member, illustrious board member, comes in and we have a chat with wonderful folks to talk about different aspects of plays in our season. And today we're focusing on Julius Caesar, which is our first show of the season. It is our Shakespeare on Tour show, and it is out and ready to go. It's already been scheduled out. It performs from February through May, through the beginning of May. Um, Check us out on our website as well. There are public performances, but we are still booking. So if you have a school, a community center, a a library, a and any we are ready and able to perform for you. It is a shortened version of Julius Caesar, so that it fits within a school's class period. So the whole thing in its entirety is 55 minutes. That includes a prologue of hello, my name is, and we are the San Francisco Shakespeare Festival, all the way through the show, and a quick Q&A from the actors and the audience members. So excited to see you all here. And we're starting off with Julius Caesar, part of our season of Empire. And you can also check out our season announcement on our website. And without further ado, I am turning it over to Dan Rabinowitz and Dr. Will Tosh. So excited to have them here today.
Great. Carla, thank you very much. And Will, as always, it's a huge, both a personal and an intellectual and institutional pleasure to have you join us again. And as you can see from the multitudes who have already logged in, my views are very widely shared here in California, and we're most grateful for your help.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to kind of jump in a couple of framing observations and questions for your thought and comment about this play. And Will and I are picking up on some of the questions which many of our friends and supporters who have logged in have previously posted. But we'll take it farther as we always do, and often in unexpected directions, because Will and I both really like going the back and forth in these discussions. We're pretty confident about the dating of this play to 1599, and one of the charming pieces of evidence about that dating comes from the diary of this young man named Thomas Plater, who was a Swiss tourist in London, and not only wrote in his diary, which has come down to us, about seeing it, but he also actually did some little sketches of the way the stage looked and the way the costumes looked at the Globe. And 1599 is an extraordinarily interesting political moment in Elizabethan England. It's 2 years after the defeat of the Armada. The country is relieved for the first time in decades from this question of European war and prospective invasion, and is also the beginning of what I would characterize, and I'm very eager to hear Will's thoughts about this, on the part of people like Sir Francis Walsingham and others who were extraordinarily important in the government. There is a new focus on the idea of English history as being something that's important and something that the educated class at least should understand and be aware of. And it's at the same time that the Armada has relieved some of the external pressure, the Armada's defeat. We also see the beginnings of a kind of a proto-imperial England as well, the beginnings of the formation of the East India Company, the idea of the Virginia Company, the beginnings of constructing the charters for England's colonial expansion throughout the rest of the world. There is a sense of forward progress and political weight to what's going on in England that's, I think, a very important backdrop to this. And of course, it precisely fits within the beginning of the what became the catastrophic, but what initially was thought of as the extraordinarily promising Irish expedition by the Earl of Essex to subdue Ireland and the Irish rebels, which turned out to be catastrophically bad. So there's a political context to this that I think in some ways is interesting. And Will, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Well done. Thank you for not only that very kind introduction to me, but also so brilliantly setting the scene uh, contextually for the England of 1599 and when Shakespeare's writing Julius Caesar. I mean, this play is really interesting for maybe many reasons, but I suppose there are sort of two um, frames with which theatre historians get really excited by Julius Caesar. And one of them is that it's, as you pointed out, a really early uh, um, it's one of the very early performances at the Globe. The Globe is built in spring and summer 1599, and really very soon after it is finished and it opens, we have this pretty unambiguous account by Thomas Platter. Thank you for that wonderful Germanic pronunciation, Dan. I have to say, I just English go straight for Platter, and you're like
Yeah, that's well,
Platter.
My Swiss grandmother would roll over in her grave if I didn't
Totally,
get that
totally.
right, Will.
So he comes along and writes this brilliant account about seeing a play about Julius Caesar in the thatched house over the river. And in the course of his account of it, in his sort of his it's kind of a diary, it's kind of account of his travels. He just provides lots of really interesting additional information about the social practice of going to the theatre. So he describes how he and his friends dine, and then they cross the river and they go to see the show. So that sort of fits it into the kind of course of the day. He doesn't name the Globe, but there isn't another thatched theatre on the south bank of the river at this point in history, and certainly not one, as far as we know, that's putting on a play about Julius Caesar. So everything kind of lines up. So we're pretty sure it's one of the early plays written for the Globe. It may be the first one that Shakespeare writes for the Globe, and there are some production elements that we might want to talk about a little bit later that give us potentially some hints that Shakespeare's really pushing the kind of envelope. You know, he's really kind of going, what can I do in this beautiful big new playhouse that will really impress the punters and draw people in. So that's one frame, kind of theatre historical frame. The other is the sort of political historical frame, which you've alluded to already, and as well as being, quite literally fin de siècle, the sort of end of century moments where everyone slightly loses their mind, like we all did in the 1990s and got freaked out by the millennium bug. Who remembers that? Like, sort of every era has its fin de siècle moment, and I think for England in the 1590s it was simultaneously a bit of a breather. And as you pointed out, Dan, we're a decade on from the failure of the Spanish Armada. The likelihood of invasion by Spain or any other hostile country was quite low, but it hadn't gone away. And in a sense, the anxiety about invasion had just flexed and morphed into anxiety about what happens at the point of regime change when the Queen dies. Because in 1599, she's very old, she's definitely on her way out. And not only it wasn't only the monarch who was ailing, but the monarch's chief advisors, the people who'd really kind of propped up government for the previous 20 or 30 years, had also died. So some listeners will have heard of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was the Queen's main counsellor for most of her reign, all of her reign really. He dies in 1598. Walsingham's dead already. He dies earlier in the 1590s. They're all just dropping like flies, and the Queen herself is obviously about to go. And the real anxiety is what happens when a monarch with no obvious heir dies, and there isn't a kind of acknowledged game plan for the succession because it's
And
just sorry, no.
No, no, and as I recall, Will, under many circumstances, even openly discussing the succession
Is
was a
illegal.
capital offense.
Yeah, so you can't.
Yeah,
There's no civic society space where you can
right,
talk about this. There are no op-eds in the newspapers. There are no talk shows where people are kind of mouthing off about the likely kind of outcomes. You just can't say anything. So those in the know kind of know that it's going to be James of
right.
James VI of Scotland, and in fact, back channel, there's loads of diplomacy going on at this point. Letters back and forth, riders up to Edinburgh, all this sort of, and in fact, you've already talked about the Essex rebellion, well, the Essex invasion of Ireland, followed by his rebellion. One of the kind of instigating elements of that was Essex's desire to be the kingmaker and be the person kind of negotiating James's succession. So it's all incredibly anxious and plays about power takeover or regime change or succession hit hard, as I think in is one way to put it. Like you can't write or talk overtly about the situation right now. So artists and writers reach for analogy and go, how can we talk about this while not talking about it? And Shakespeare had already explored that with the English history plays, exploring medieval historical turmoil. He's doing something quite similar in Julius Caesar, which is going for kind of the most standout example from history of a contested succession. And it's not even a succession because Julius Caesar isn't even a king, but the most contested form of power transfer that everyone knows about, that everyone has learnt about at school, that just stands at the kind of pinnacle of everyone's awareness to the extent that even the characters in the play kind of, while their hands are still covered in blood, go, how many ages since will people kind of, enact what we've just done by
right.
killing Caesar? So it's a really bold move on Shakespeare's part to go to intuit everyone's freaking out about the succession. What story can I tell that channels that anxiety and interest into something compelling?
And one of the questions which one of our friends and supporters had put to us, Will, was of course, like what are the sources of this play? And for the key source for this play is Plutarch's Lives, and Plutarch was a Greek living in Rome who wrote in the second century A.D. We owe it to a variety of monastic
Mm.
libraries and the preservation of Plutarch's Lives written in Greek through the Dark Ages. It was it was translated into Latin in 1470 and then published extensively in Rome. Then it was translated into French in 1559 by Bishop Amiot, and then ultimately Sir Thomas North in 1579 brings it to England in an English translation of Amiot's translation of Plutarch's Lives. But there are very interesting and significant deviations from the way Plutarch presents some of these characters and the way Shakespeare looks at some of these characters. It's a very interesting transformation. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask Will to think about a little bit is the play departs from lots of other Shakespearean tragedies, both those written before and those written thereafter, in the sense that the tragedy typically takes the name of the main character and charts the course of the main character towards his death, or in Cleopatra's case, her death, at the end of the play. And this play it's called Julius Caesar. It's called The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. But Caesar dies very soon into the play, and the rest of the play is about what happens thereafter and the war and Brutus. And so it's always been sort of an interesting question for me whether this play should have been named The Tragedy of Brutus rather than the tragedy of Caesar. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about that, Will.
It's so interesting. It's a real Janet Leigh in Psycho moment, isn't it? It's sort of like the person you've kind of got you've put your tag on for the course of the play is the one who kind of gets knocked off a few acts in.
Right,
I suppose partly it's the convention of naming a play after the highest status character,
right,
but that in itself is a sort of interesting nuance because the whole play, or at least the casus belli for the play, is like, should he be the highest status character?
right,
Should Julius Caesar be placing himself above the other oligarchs of Rome? You know, if he's anything, he's primus inter pares, he's first among equals. But even that, Brutus and Cassius have their real doubts about. So it's an interesting decision artistically to say, yeah, this is the name of this play is this figure who is the one who carries the weight and the interest, especially because in Plutarch, which is a set of parallel biographies. So each person is paired with someone else, usually a Roman with a Greek. So Julius Caesar is paired in Plutarch's biography with Alexander the Great. So these sort of, again, two absolute standout figures from classical history, not unencumbered with controversy for lots of reasons. Interesting that Caesar is placed in a comparable position to Alexander the Great, presumably in the capacity of land conqueror. Obviously, Caesar as a general goes out and conquers loads of Europe, but he's not a king, and he isn't even the sort of, you know, he isn't even the ruler of Rome, really. So the choice on Plutarch's part is interesting as well. Now Brutus has an entry in Plutarch. There's a life of Brutus as
right,
well. So that there isn't really a strong, compelling reason why the play isn't the tragedy of Brutus. Um, there are plays called that from this era, you know. Brutus exists as a sort of literary tragic figure slash hero as well. Um, but it is certainly the case that the actions of Brutus and Cassius are pored over repeatedly by philosophers, ethicists, historians, even school children from the first century BC onwards.
right,
So that as soon as the conspirators make their move, people are questioning whether it was the right thing to do, what the consequences were, whether the ends can justify the means, whether the consequences can impugn the actions. All of those kind of philosophical discussions become incredibly active. And when Shakespeare was at school, at grammar school, part of the way he was taught to write and to think and to kind of frame his arguments was in writing little kind of essays that argued a famous issue from history one way and then the other. It's quite a
right,
legal training, really, in many ways. It's sort of, so the essay would be like, you know, was Brutus right to kill Julius Caesar? Here's my yes. Here's my no. So he, like many people who go through a grammar school education, are encouraged, are given the training to think about the pros and the cons. And obviously, that's a great training for any kind of debating or law. It's also quite a good training for a dramatist because that means you're sort of able to think yourself into these different brains and different subject positionalities and different principles to think, well, you know, he can write someone who is compellingly like Brutus and also turn on a sixpence and write someone who is compellingly like Mark Antony, who feels the complete opposite. So
right.
this is sort of a long-winded way of answering your question, which is to say that in a way, Julius Caesar is less the central character and more the central question. It's like, why Julius Caesar? You know, it's sort of whither Caesar, why Caesar,
Right.
rather than necessarily Caesar being the character that everyone in that theater wants to watch.
You know, it's interesting, Will, because I've been sort of meditating a little bit about your what I think is your extremely insightful posing of this in the context of the succession question. And what's always struck me about the way the play is presented, because Caesar knew, Shakespeare knew more of the Roman history than is presented in the play. And what's fascinating about this is that this play, the axial point of this play, is not Caesar's effective capture of the Roman Republic by bringing his legions across the Rubicon, ultimately collapsing Roman politics, putting his Gaul supporters into the Senate. Nobody talks about that. What they're talking about is the question of the crowning, which is so interesting in this context. That's what Brutus and to some degree Cassius as well are actually focusing on, rather than what we would probably, looking at this as sort of modern historians, would think well, actually it's the antecedent effective capture of the Republic by legionary force that's really going on vis-a-vis Caesar. But it's so interesting that that's the place where Shakespeare chose to focus. It's this kind of thaumaturgical symbolism of the crowning that becomes the axial moment.
Well, look, it will surprise no one to learn that the people in the Renaissance are quite interested in Rome, like sort of, but that's what the Renaissance is. It's a rediscovery of classical knowledge and a kind of really intimate understanding of classical politics as a literature primarily. But it's a very complex and ambivalent obsession because everything about Greece and Rome in its imperial kind of period is everything political and religious about imperial Rome is off-putting to Christian Europe. It
Right.
is not Christian, it's pagan. And although, of course, the empire has something going for it in terms of kingship, the Republican period in Rome, as indeed the democratic era in Greece, or quasi-democratic era, is really shocking to monarchic Europe, which does not have what we have now, which is a kind of implicit faith and belief in the idea of rule by the many. That is just absolutely seen as a pathway to chaos.
Well,
So
we see that. I mean, Shakespeare is very explicit about that. It's an extraordinarily powerful scene in which Cinna, the poet,
yeah,
is killed by the mob.
yeah.
There's a clear sense of the dangers of the lack of hierarchical order in the
And
Elizabethan perspective that's embedded in that scene in a very
and
powerful
he
way.
comes back. Shakespeare comes back to it in a later Roman play in the play Coriolanus, which
Mm.
is it's like a sort of even like a real like Julius Caesar has quite sour moments, has to be said, but like Coriolanus is a really embittered play for lots of,
Yes.
particularly about politics. It's very cynical about all forms of politics, but
Well,
particularly about swaying the people.
Coriolanus is the play that always brings to mind the Aristotle's observation that a man without a city is either a beast or a god,
Mm,
and that's like so apposite
mm, mm,
to Coriolanus. But it's there is a one of the things that I've always found just profoundly interesting about Julius Caesar as a play is what is obviously, I'm sort of extending some of your comments, Will, is that Shakespeare's actually leaving the audience in a state of complete ambiguity. We have no idea whether Shakespeare actually is in favor of what the conspirators have done or not.
yeah.
It's profoundly, unsettlingly ambiguous. He really leaves the audience, and both the Elizabethan audience and 400 some years later ourselves, to make up our own minds about what we think about how this is presented.
I agree with that to an extent, and I think what's interesting is that I think the play lands really differently in on the page and on the stage. And I
Mm.
think it really, and I was saying earlier to our listeners that I find these discussions both so joyous but also very frustrating because I seldom get a chance to see the productions that we're sort of that we're serving in this discussion. Because
Yes.
I'm going to say that one of the things that really changes one's interpretation of the sort of ethical weight of the story is performance. And the performer of Julius Caesar has a huge amount of sway, actually, in terms of how the story lands. I've seen versions of this play where the figure of Caesar really is as a presented as a dictator, presented as someone who there is a kind of, there's a real kind of logic and argument for getting rid of him. And I've seen versions of the play where he's just one politician among many and a real victim of kind of the crowd. Sorry, that's my dog looking off in
Yes.
the hallway. Um, so Shakespeare leaves that open, but he also, I think, very deliberately doesn't write a very big part for Caesar. That there
Mm.
isn't a lot that the actor can go on, unlike Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, who have gorgeous parts where there
Yeah.
is loads happening, and a huge amount of kind of possibility and choice about how you might sort of shape and kind of finesse those roles. And certainly once you get into the kind of main funeral orations in the middle of the play, what how the audience will be swayed, as in the literal theatre audience, but also the stage audience of Roman citizens. That's really open. That's really open. Um, I mean, this is a completely personal view and probably highly revealing, but I sort of uh, uh, I do find myself Team Brutus for most of the play, I have to say, partly because I was like an underdog and he shoots himself so spectacularly in the foot with handing the kind of podium to Mark Antony. But
Yes.
but but actually Antony's cynicism in working with the crowd, a little bit like Coriolanus, is for me so off-putting that he's sort of able to kind of wield that sort of energy in such a deft way. So my reading has always been that probably Shakespeare's kind of, oh, it's hard, isn't it? But probably for Shakespeare, it is the Brutus line that he's most kind of interested in. But then again, he writes a whole play about Antony
Yes.
a year
Yes.
or so later, which you're also lucky enough to see this summer. So it you know, he knows.
It is certainly the case that there is an an interesting but not an attractive, canny, manipulative aspect to Antony that is clearly laid out here. I mean,
Mm.
Antony understands exactly what he's doing, and he understands exactly how someone with Brutus's sense of public honor can be manipulated, despite the reservations of Cassius and the other conspirators. Um, Antony's completely on top of his game in terms of setting up the funeral orations
Yeah.
and is entirely conscious of exactly what he's intending to do. Um, his motives are a little more masked. I think it's
Yeah.
not, it's a complicated, a lot of personal ambition there as well.
Well, it's always a bit of a hiding to nothing to well, no, I'm going to slightly nuance that point. It is often a frustrating experience to try and hold Shakespeare's character dramaturgy in numerous plays at the same time. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking of examples like Richard of Gloucester across into Richard III, or Queen Margaret across various history plays, or even Falstaff across Henry IV, parts one and two, and Mary Rose of Windsor. Mark Antony and Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Antony and Cleopatra, for example, are a really interesting comparison because admittedly lots of years have elapsed. They are sort of different people, but they're also different people. Uh,
Yes.
and so sort of who these people are is a really good question, and it raises lots of debates about our own requirement for character continuity in drama. It exposes some of that gulf in time between us who live in a very post psychological realism, post Stanislavskian character preparation, post Freudian kind of world where we want all of that really clearly delineated, and Shakespeare's time where character is there, but it also serves plot and it also serves morality and kind of ethical probity. And it isn't so much about consistent and coherent inner lives. So the Mark Antony and Julius Caesar is the Mark Antony of that period in history. He does what Mark Antony does, and Shakespeare is making a coherent and meaningful human character out of that. But it isn't necessarily a character with the full Hall of Mirrors hinterland that stretches all
Right.
the way back that will lead forward to the Mark Antony in Antony and Cleopatra. So I
You
don't,
know,
yeah,
no,
sorry.
go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm done.
You bring to mind Chekhov's wonderful observation that the job of the dramatist is not to answer questions, but to pose them in their proper framing.
Yeah,
And that's that's
poses a lot. Dan, I can see we've got a question from Kathy in
yes,
the
Kathy. Let's see where.
So the cat, I can pop up because I was like, oh, questions.
Yes,
Yeah, I didn't, this is Kathy. I didn't mean it needed to be answered right now, but I just didn't want
it's
to
a great
forget it.
question, Kathy. Shoot.
Okay, well, it's there. Let me read just, so, I often hear people talking about the fool in Shakespeare and how it changed with different actors from Will Kemp to someone. I'm just curious what we know or what you know, Dr. Tosh or Daniel, about the company in 1599 and to follow. Who might have played Caesar? And to your
Yeah,
point about the
yeah,
interpretation and
mm,
how it lands.
yeah.
Do you,
We
anything to say about that? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we know quite a lot actually. I mean, there's lots of sort of bits and pieces of evidence, company lists and legal documentation that list the shareholders of the theatre company, who are also the kind of key actors, the leading actors. What we don't typically have is cast lists for each play, so we don't really know who precisely played whom. There's a bit of a kind of clue that some people, some theatre historians glean from Hamlet, which is probably written the following year. It's probably written in 1600, may even be written directly after Julius Caesar, potentially. And some of you will know Hamlet very well. There's a point in Hamlet where a bunch of actors arrive at the palace at Elsinore, and everyone's very excited at their arrival and start talking about theatre in various ways. And Polonius, the sort of fussy courtier Polonius, who's Ophelia's dad, is trying to ingratiate himself to Hamlet, and tells him that he was once a student actor. He acted at university, and in this university production, he played Caesar, and that he was killed. He was killed in the Capitol. And Hamlet makes some facetious remark about that. And it is suggested, not particularly with any firm evidence, but quite a lot of likelihood, that that's a kind of in joke, that the actor who plays Hamlet had also played Brutus, and the actor who plays Polonius had also played Caesar. And we know who played Hamlet. That was Richard Burbage, who was the sort of lead actor in the company. So almost certainly Burbage, I say almost certainly, it seems highly likely that Burbage played Brutus, which, as Dan and I discussed, although is not the title role, is the main tragic role in the play. And the whichever actor it was who specialized in slightly annoying, fussy politicians played Caesar, which of course also gives a slightly unexpected kind of gloss to the character, where we might be much more inclined to see a kind of Mussolini figure in our kind of post 20th century history. Maybe that's suggesting that Shakespeare's first audience, or Shakespeare himself, saw Caesar in very different terms, as a kind of different kind of character line. Um, if I go away and do some digging, I might well be able to find out if there is a association of actor name and Polonius and or Caesar, but I'm afraid I haven't got it off the top of my head. But we can certainly identify Brutus.
That is terrific. No, don't do any more digging.
Okay.
That's more than enough. Wonderful answer. Thank you.
I want to pop in here because now it's about time that we want to start taking more questions. We do
questions.
have questions that were submitted, but I have one that has not been asked. And what about the ladies? And I
Hmm.
know that they were played by men at the time, but these two characters of Portia and Calpurnia, um, Portia has a very talks very much about like a pedigree and I was
Yeah.
Cato's daughter and I did this and I did that. Um, gives spoilers, y'all, sorry, gives herself a voluntary wound
Mhm.
and talks about the stoicism of the time and is like, no, I can take it, and is reputed to have swallowed fire, like coals of fire.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I would love to hear about the presence of these two female characters, knowing that they were played by men at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, tell me.
Uh, Now, am I going to get this right? I think I'm probably right in saying that Julius Caesar is the Shakespeare play with fewest female characters in it. I think two is probably a record for a female cast list. Um, and I think Portia's an amazing part.
Yes, yes.
They're
Portia's a
not
very
they're not
strong character.
they're not huge. And that again, I think is an interesting choice
They're there
on
so quickly
and
to
that
show
and
the militaristic.
I think that's right. And I think that sense, and there's probably a bigger discussion to be had about the kind of gendering of Rome in at least in Shakespeare's play. Obviously productions take all sorts of choices that will speak to our own moment in the right way. But Shakespeare's vision of Rome is a very male one. And that I think also says something about the presence of Rome in the early modern English imagination. It is a very gendered and masculinized history. It's a very masculinized language. The teaching of Latin is gendered, so it's quite widespread among educated men. So the school that Shakespeare went to, the grammar school in Stratford, he received all of his instruction in Latin. So it was like like a language immersion school, like Spanish immersion school. He was just taught in Latin. So he was sort of granted another mother tongue. Now that's the purpose of that kind of education. Um, and I think that the phrase mother tongue is obviously a kind of resonant one in itself. And I think the idea is that English boys are defeminized by being taught Latin. So there's something very overt about the association of Rome and masculinity. Rome and masculinity, but also Roman masculinity. So, and I think we see that in what Shakespeare writes. It may not even be a wholly conscious act on his part. It may be reflective of a kind of imaginative lack, that actually imagining himself into Roman femaleness defeats even Shakespeare. And he ends up with two relatively short scenes. It takes him another play detailing another culture that you are also putting on to think about what happens with that kind of erotic meeting or the presence of male and female in the classical world. He does that through Egypt, through Antony and Cleopatra. I'm really struck by how he's just not, and not only are the scenes not very long, both of them are structurally similar. They're both similar scenes of a wife coming to her husband and saying, "Hey, what's wrong?" That's also a scenic unit, a kind of dramatic meme that Shakespeare writes again and again and again. Those of you who know Henry IV Part 1 will remember the scene with Kate and Hotspur, where again it's the same scene. It's structurally and kind of emotionally identical. And that again is a bit of a sort of, I hate to say it, kind of a fallback for Shakespeare. It's like sort of like it, if you don't quite know what to do with your female characters, give them that scene, because that at least gets him to where he needs to get. So I think it's a funny one, Portia and Calpurnia, because they're wonderful parts and there's so much there, but also I think suggestive a little bit of, dare I say it, dramaturgical and imaginative lack on Shakespeare's part.
Well, it's interesting in the sense that casts, Will, I think that's a very insightful observation. And what it suggests to me, though, is the interesting evolution, because when we do get to Antony and Cleopatra, which we will this very summer, um, it's hard not to see that as Cleopatra's play in a way, and
Totally,
and and
totally.
and and the and it may well be that what allowed Shakespeare to surmount precisely the human backdrop that you've been describing so ably was his extraordinarily acute sense of the complexities of the relationship between the two cultures, between
Mm,
Egypt and Rome,
mm,
and that freed him in some respects to be able to speak more directly to the female character.
mm.
It's going to be interesting in our season for all of you. We hope that everybody on this, will, you and peers included, will come see these
I
shows.
hope so.
But
I hope
it's you've raised an extraordinarily interesting point, and a very and it's a remarkable contrast between Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra.
And I should say, I don't, I don't think Shakespeare's bad at writing women. I think he writes wonderful female parts, but I
Yes.
think in just this imaginative frame, it
Yeah.
it isn't giving him what he needs, I guess is the answer.
Going back to some questions, and you teased out a little bit, Will, about like the globe and how Shakespeare was able to kind of push the boundaries and use the
Yeah,
space in
yeah,
a
yeah.
different way. One of the questions was talk about different stagings.
Mm.
And maybe this wasn't the full intent of that question, but I also wonder like what kinds of things that are used in Julius Caesar that Shakespeare was like, "Ooh, I've got the globe."
Ooh,
Just
I've
like
got the globe.
anybody, we're like, "Ooh, what do I got? What tools do I have?"
So you will have discovered in your preparation for the play that there is a very long storm in the early phases of the play that kind of kicks off in 1-3, doesn't it? And then kind of rolls on through into kind of well into Act Two. Um, that's the first time Shakespeare stages a storm, like with
Ah.
sort of stage directions and certainly one of that length. And there's been some quite compelling scholarship that suggests he does that really very deliberately, and because he knows that there are um, sort of staging and theatre production ways to produce a storm that are really exciting and compelling, whether that's loud drumming to create thunder, or indeed low drumming to create the sense of kind of ongoing thunder, or pyrotechnics or fireworks to create lightning flashes, and those could be sort of bursts of fire, flame in the tyrant house in the gallery. It could even be something called a swivel, which is a firework on a string. So the string is sort of set across the theatre, sometimes top to bottom, sometimes sort of top to the stage, sometimes across the pillars. And a firework is lit and just shoots across on a string to create a lightning bolt. You can roll cannonballs in the roof of the theatre to create a. There's a whole load of ways to really maximize your surround sound special effect kind of attention grabbing. And it again has been suggested that doing that is also even a way to get people in off the street. Because if you've got your kind of brand new theatre, beautiful new building that you've just built and spent lots of money on, you want your first play to be the thing that people walking past on Maiden Lane or walking along the river go, "What the hell was that?" when they hear a crash or see a flash of light and go, "Oh, I'll go in and have a look." So it may well be that Shakespeare is crafting this sort of wild early scenes in Julius Caesar around the resources that his stage might offer to get people into the playhouse.
Oh, I can definitely see that, Will.
Totally.
I can definitely see that. There is a financial canniness
Yeah.
that runs through all of Shakespeare's life, and in some ways even sets him apart from many of his theater world contemporaries. He did better than most did, And that's obviously a question of focus, attention, conscious choice,
Yeah,
and a deep commercial intelligence
absolutely,
alongside the extraordinary artistic gifts.
absolutely, absolutely.
I know we have questions that, looking at the questions that were submitted before, a lot of them are talking about the history. How does it compare? And I feel like you've talked about that, and the character arcs in terms of Brutus and Cassius and Mark
Mhm.
Antony, and how Julius Caesar kind of and stops. Um, I see
Less arc, more a
yeah,
curve,
half rainbow,
half
as it
rainbow.
were.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Thinking about, I'm seeing also a lot of folks asking about Julius Caesar and its relevance to today, and what those connections are. Obviously, this play was chosen for multiple reasons with SF Shakes. You know, we have a season called Empire, and we are exploring what that means, whether it's, are we witnessing in our own time the rise of an empire or the fall of one? And things are shifting dramatically in the United States of America right now. Um, and
Yeah,
be that
yeah,
as it may, yeah,
yeah.
go
Well,
feel.
it's, well, I mean, the thing that leaps off the page there, Carla, is no kings. We,
Yeah.
we have gathered in our millions in our streets around the banner of no kings. And it's certainly striking that it's the act of the tender of the crown that becomes such an important motivation in the character whose general character we typically admire in Brutus. And so there's a very, very strong resonance there. And that I don't treat that lightly or as a surface resonance. It's not.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, from quite an early stage, Julius Caesar has been seen as a lens for contemporary political debates. Um, in the 30s, Orson Welles stages a very famous modern dress production with a overtly kind of Mussolini Caesar, sort of doing it as a kind of analysis and a sort of excoriation of Italian fascism. Only a few years ago, of course, the Theatre in the Park, the Delacorte, staged a kind of overtly kind of Trumpian Caesar, caused a big old stink. I mean, what's interesting when both such stagings are offered and people object to them is a sort of blunt lack of recognition about what the play is actually about. In the sense that sort of the actual arc, whether that's a full arc or a half arc of the various characters, it is far more ambiguous and ambivalent than as we've been discussing, than X good, Y bad. It's not clear, that Brutus and Cassius are in the right. It's not clear that Caesar is in the wrong. I saw a fascinating production at the Folger in October, called Julius X, and I'm really sorry I can't remember the name of the dramatist who wrote it, but it was a close adaptation of Caesar crossed with the Malcolm X story. It was so brilliant, but also slightly fell into the trap of thinking the play and the story was more morally overt than it is, because it wasn't clear to me in the story that I saw in Julius X that the character should die. I don't think probably this character shouldn't die. What is happening? So it becomes an interesting issue, and I think back to a much earlier period and a different play, not in fact Julius Caesar, but Richard II, when the Earl of Essex, who Dan has mentioned this evening, who's a very high-ranking English courtier, attempted to basically launch a coup, attempted to sort of take over the person of the Queen and get himself in charge. When he was the night before, the day before he launched his coup, his followers went to Shakespeare Theatre Company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, and said, "We'll give you £10 if you stage Richard II." And Shakespeare's Theatre Company said, "It's a bit old. It's 5 years old. We're not normally playing it, but all right, if that's what you want." Because the assumption was that a play about a kind of hot, strong aristocrat taking over control from a weak monarch would somehow soften up the people of London for a similar thing happening the next day. I mean, had the people who commissioned that play either properly read it or thought about the consequences in the following plays, that they might not have been so keen. And certainly it didn't work because Essex's rebellion was completely unsupported by London. So what plays do politically and how they land often isn't quite the same thing as what the artists concerned intended, or even sometimes what malign agents or malign producers or instigators intend when they ask for the play to be staged or object to it being staged. So it is unquestionably a play for our time when it comes to thinking very deeply about what politics are and what regime change might mean and consequences and justification, but it quite rightly doesn't offer clear answers about the way forward. And I see Catherine was very kindly just credited Al Letson, of course, thank you, as the playwright of Julius X. Thank you, Catherine.
Yes. The Will, your point, it casts into even starker relief what has always struck me about the discussions and the character evolution after the assassination, during the war, and leading up to Philippi. There is an elegiac tone to the way Brutus and Cassius deal with each other in those scenes, which is clearly an extraordinarily successful attempt on Shakespeare's part to render the complexities and how, in some respects, how morally uncertain they really are about these consequences and the war that followed. And of course about the catastrophic effect that it will have on their lives, which they approach with a measure of stoicism, but also almost an elegiac measure of how they view the world and the arc of their own lives. It's clearly a deep and conscious ambiguity that is created by brilliantly gifted writing around those scenes.
Well, I can see Jared just put a question in the chat about censorship, and that slightly speaks to your point, Dan, in the sense that I think one of the things Shakespeare does with his exploration of classical history, and in part this is an answer for Jared, which is the play is allowed because it's well-known historical fact that no one is denying. No one in Shakespeare's time told any other story about Julius Caesar. This was the story that everyone knew, but also like Brutus dies, and he's punished for what he does.
Yes.
He's haunted by a ghost and then he dies. It ends quite badly for him. So that idea that, a bit like sort of Hayes Code morality, illegitimate actions are punished, and that's really the issue from the point of view of a kind of socially anxious and socially conservative English society in the 1590s, where any play that goes on a public stage has to be read by Master of the Revels and censored accordingly. It's not, you can never talk about political themes, although you probably better stay off religion, but you need to sort of show the consequences of behaving badly. So that sort of sense that we've touched on a few times tonight about what does Shakespeare think about Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony. The ambivalence and ambiguity is there in the play, but the character journey tells a slightly more unambiguous story, which is Brutus and Cassius end really badly, Mark Antony ends better, but hold your horses. A few years later, it all goes badly for him
Right.
because of the next phase of his perceived error in his political and personal life. So I would be wary of taking that arc at face value. I think that is the history arc and the sort of politically acceptable arc. The nuance and interest in the play is what we feel about those characters and who we empathize with and who we don't. That's sort of, I think, where we might get a bit more of sort of Shakespeare's own thoughts and beliefs.
Will, I've always, if I
I
could,
do have to say, Dan, hold
yes.
on, hold on. I'm so sorry, y'all. Time flies.
It does
It is
fly.
Oh my goodness, yes,
1:01.
we're 1 o'clock.
It
Yes.
is, we are really at time. There's a couple things that I think we might be able to extend just a little bit, but I want to wrap it up for folks who want to who were like, I need to leave. This is my lunch hour or
Go on, shower
whatever.
people. Go,
Yes,
run,
it's
flee.
I so appreciate you all being here. But I want to say before folks start leaving that if you've appreciated what Dr. Will Tosh has talked about and like his, I just adore having him on. Want to say that he has a book, his latest book.
Yes.
Straight Acting, The Hidden Queer Lives of William Shakespeare, and you can buy yours today. So you can support this incredible yes, yes,
This is the English
there it
edition, not
is.
the
It is.
not the US
There
one.
it not the
Okay.
US, but it is out and about. And I do want to say congratulations for having that out. And y'all check it out. Yep, there it
Fabulous.
is.
There you
There
go.
it
Yep.
is.
It is. It is, by the way, it is a terrific book. It is brilliantly written and brilliantly structured. It's a great contribution to the literature. It really, really is. Um, well,
And I do want to, there's still, hold on, Dan. I know we've got all these questions and all these things to talk about, but let me wrap up here to say that if you feel so inclined, if you feel so moved, we could not do these things without you, the watchers, the audience, the people who believe in us, who believe in Shakespeare, who believe in the power of Shakespeare, the power of these themes. Please, if you feel so inclined or so moved, you can donate to us at sfshakes.org/donate. And come check out Julius Caesar in its truncated Shakespeare on Tour form, directed by April Ballesteros. And we have public viewings that are free to the audience. There's a couple that are ticketed in Fair Oaks Performing Arts Center. In the end of this month, we are going to Redwood City, Tiburon, San Francisco, Mountain View, and more libraries are coming. And as well as we do have some openings on our dance card. So if you are so moved, go ahead and email us, contact us at sfshakes.org. And we have a few more minutes if Dan and Will are
I'm just going to close. I think I can close
so
this because
appreciate
we do need to let first. We need to give Will a wonderful internet round of applause from our dear friend and just one of our true intellectual guides in all of this. But the second thing is, and I'll close with something which is genuinely whimsical, which is Will mentioned that the conspirators in the Essex Rebellion had commissioned Richard II with the idea that its portrayal of the deposition of a king and his replacement by Bolingbroke would be something that the crowd would respond to and would believe politically might form a broader base of support for Essex's ill-fated rebellion. I've always, if you could pick which historical moment you'd like to be a fly on the wall for, I have always thought that it would be a wonderful moment to be a fly on the wall when Burbage and Shakespeare were hauled into before the Privy Council and interrogated about whether their company, by agreeing to perform this at the request of the conspirators, was actually part of the conspiracy. They were very canny. They walked away unscathed from that. But I've always thought to myself, boy, that would be a terrific little exculpatory presentation to hear. So I just want to close by first again by thanking Will, by thanking Carla, and by thanking all of you. We are so grateful for your interest, for your support, for your engagement, the work that we do really, and to close the arc of this question of what's the significance of all of this today. We believe that this art matters. We believe that this art matters to all of us in moral ways, in political ways, in the way of providing insight into character, and the way of allowing us to be better people than we are, both in our personal lives, in our individual lives, and in our social and collective lives. And so we believe in the work that we're doing here. We are profoundly grateful for all of your support and engagement. And stay tuned, because we will be back with more Let's Talk About. So one more round of applause for Will, and thank you all for joining us.